John 3:24. Non dum enim missus fuerat in carcerem Johannes. For John had not yet been sent into prison. This is just a brief aside in the course of the evangelist's narrative concerning the baptisms that are going on at this place where there's a lot of water, as we saw in the last verse. And it's short and relatively easy, but there's a couple interesting features that we might pick out for our benefit. One is the interesting compound form here with missus fuerat. This, in fact, is a third-person singular, pluperfect indicative form from the verb mitto, mittere, misi, missus, of the third conjugation. Missus fuerat is actually the equivalent of missus erat. Why, though, do we have fuerat instead of erat? Well, the simple answer is this is just a thing that happened increasingly in later Latin and certainly in the Vulgate, that the third principal part of sum esse, which of course is fui, that's how we form the perfect system of that irregular verb which we see so often, sum esse, was increasingly used itself in the pluperfect. Fuerat by itself means he had been in these pluperfect compounds in the passive voice, and presumably reflects trends in the speech of late antique inhabitants of the Roman Empire, etc. So it need not detain us too much. You'll just be trained by practice the more you read in the Vulgate and in late Latin in general to notice and understand this distinction. So you can almost just sort of disregard the fu element there and forget that it's there, if it makes things easier for you. Now, what are the other forms of the pluperfect tense? How would we do this if, let's say, we wanted to say, you had been sent? Well, let's sketch out all the forms here. All right, missus is just going to be repeated. Now, remember, we have to treat this as missus aum. That is a first/second declension adjective. So that ending is going to change depending on the subject of this verb. If, for instance, we were talking about a woman instead of a man, it would be missa erat. In this case, or if we were talking about an inanimate object, missum erat, etc. But let's just go down the list here. Missus eram, I had been sent. Missus eras, you had been sent. Missus erat, he had been sent. Eramus, eratis, erant. That's helpful review for you to do. You might also think along the same lines about how to conjugate the perfect system of sum esse fui. Write down your list like that. But remember, in combination, these words mean something different than they would individually. Eram, eras, erat, etc. Individually would simply be the imperfect forms, the imperfect active forms, I should say, of sum esse. But when you combine that imperfect set of forms with this perfect passive participle, missus, you get this compound verb tense, the passive pluperfect system. See how that works? Non dum enim missus erat. Non dum is a super useful word. I think we've talked about this before. Not yet. If you're trying to speak Latin or use it in the classroom, this is a word you will have many occasions to use, and it's worth remembering. Not to be confused, as it sometimes is, by the way, with ad hoc, up till this point, till now. Frequently in my class, I will say, sunt ne rogationes ad hoc. Are there questions up to this point? Are there any questions that we haven't dealt with that are still lingering? And sometimes no one will put up their hands, in which case I say, non dum. I sort of reply to myself and say, I see, not yet. There are not yet any questions. So that might just help you to remember that word. Carcer, carceris is a third declension noun, and it's one that we see fairly often. The Romans typically, in all periods of their civilization, did not incarcerate. You hear that English derivative of the Latin word as I'm saying it. They did not incarcerate people typically for long periods. You might be sent to a penal colony. You might be sent to the mines. There were all kinds of horrible punishments that you could suffer, but simply sitting around for no reason in a prison in a prison cell or in a jail cell for a really long time was not part of most Roman punishments. The Romans didn't prefer to have people hanging around, taking up food and water and requiring maintenance for very extended periods. So there are lots of other penalties: exile, death by various means, and the death penalty, of course, as you know if you've read the New Testament, was carried out in different ways depending on one's status. So low status people without citizenship typically and other privileges could be crucified, as slaves were in the aftermath of slave revolts, for instance. But citizens generally were beheaded when they were executed, and that in fact was a kind of right of citizenship, if we can consider it such in a sort of macabre sense. But you can imagine if you were facing death, it would be easier to face the prospect of decapitation than crucifixion. Anyways, we're getting a little bit too far down the garden path here. So, not yet had John been sent by Herod here, who's the active agent lurking in the background, into prison, into jail.